The red dress lay shredded in the dust, torn into jagged strips like it had been dragged through barbed wire. Clara knelt on one knee, clutching a rough gray blanket tight around her body. Her face was pale, her breathing uneven. But her eyes, those eyes, were locked straight ahead, burning with something deeper than fear. It was the look of someone who knew the world had just taken something it had no right to take. Moments earlier, the summer sun over Dry Creek had been beating down so hot you could fry bacon on a shovel. The air shimmered, and the smell of horse sweat and dust hung heavy. The marketplace was alive, boots scuffing wooden porches, deals being made over sacks of grain, the low hum of small-town life, until 3 riders came in. Their spurs jingled with each step, hats pulled low, dust clinging to their coats. Nobody needed an introduction. Folks just went quiet, like the life had been sucked out of the street. Clara had asked for just a few more days to pay the protection money. Business at her little bakery had been slow. Too many debts, too few customers. She stood there with her chin up, voice steady, thinking maybe reason could win over cruelty. The lead rider didn't argue. He just grinned, swung down from his saddle, and grabbed her arm so hard she winced. Then, in the middle of the street, in front of God and everyone, they ripped her dress wide open. The sound of tearing fabric cut through the heat like a whip crack. The sheriff was there, an old man, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. But it just stayed there, trembling, never drawing. Around him, the men of Dry Creek stood rooted, knuckles white, eyes narrowed. Each one remembered the cost of standing up. Barns torched in the night, cattle shot dead in the pasture, brothers and sons laid out in pine boxes. The 3 riders laughed as they mounted up, tossing the torn fabric onto the ground like it was nothing. Their hoofbeats echoed down the dusty street until there was nothing left but the soft creak of a swinging saloon door. Clara stood alone in the blistering sun, gathering the tatters of her dignity along with the shredded remains of her dress. Somewhere in that silent crowd, there was a man who decided this would be the last time Dry Creek looked the other way. Ethan was there that day, though not in the street when it happened. He'd been hauling feed back from his ranch on the edge of town, the kind of hot, dusty ride that leaves a man's shirt plastered to his back. By the time he heard the whispers and saw the crowd breaking apart, Clara was already gone. He asked a stable hand what happened. The boy couldn't even look him in the eye, just muttered, "The riders," before turning away. Ethan felt it then, that slow, heavy burn in his chest, and he'd seen plenty of hard times. Lost his wife to fever 5 years back, buried her under the lone cottonwood tree on his land. Since then, he'd kept to himself, working cattle, fixing fences, staying clear of other folks' business. But Clara wasn't just other folks. He'd been stopping by her bakery for months, telling himself it was just for the fresh bread. Truth was, he'd been drawn to her quiet strength, the way she smiled even when the days were long and the customers scarce. And now someone had taken that smile and tried to grind it into the dirt. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch, listening to the crickets, staring at the dark outline of Dry Creek under the moonlight. In a place where law was just a word and fear was the sheriff, decent people had learned to survive by keeping their heads down. But deep down, he knew something else. If a man kept looking away long enough, one day there'd be nothing left worth looking at. By sunrise, he'd made up his mind. This wasn't about heroics, and it sure wasn't about revenge alone. It was about the kind of place Dry Creek would be when the next generation came along. And it was about Clara, about what a man's willing to risk when he finally decides he's had enough. It happened a week later. The morning air was already warm, that kind of dry heat that promised a blistering afternoon. Folks were setting up their stalls, the sound of crates being dropped and wagon wheels creaking filling the street. That's when the 2 riders came in. Not the whole gang, just a pair, but their swagger said they thought 2 was plenty. They went about their business like they owned the place, stopping at each merchant, taking coins, sometimes more. When they reached a young woman selling eggs, one of them grabbed her by the chin, leaning in too close, grinning like a wolf. That's when Ethan stepped out from the alley. He didn't shout, didn't run, just walked, slow and steady, his boots thudding in the dust. "Let her go," he said, voice low enough to make folks stop what they were doing. The rider laughed, but it was cut short when Ethan's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling in the dirt. The second man reached for his gun, but before he could draw, an older voice rang out. It was Thomas, Clara's father, standing behind a barrel with a rifle pointed dead steady. "Not today," he said. That was all it took for a few others to step forward. Merchants, farmers, even the blacksmith with a hammer in his hand. The two riders looked around, realized the tide had turned, and decided they weren't paid enough to die in Dry Creek. They mounted up and rode out, leaving the street buzzing with the kind of energy the town hadn't felt in years. But if they thought that was the end of it, they had no idea what was coming next. Ethan looked at the faces around him. These were people who'd been quiet for too long, people who were now ready to talk, to plan. That afternoon, in the back room of the saloon, they gathered to figure out what came next. And if you're the kind who believes a town's worth fighting for, or you just don't want to miss what happens when the whole gang comes back for blood, you might want to stick around and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're going to want to see the next part. They came back 3 days later. You could hear them before you saw them. The pounding of hooves, the metallic rattle of rifles slung across saddles. This time it wasn't 2 men. It was more than 10. Riding side by side down the main road like they were rolling into enemy territory. But Dry Creek wasn't the same town they'd ridden through a week ago. Behind overturned wagons and stacks of crates, townsfolk crouched in the shadows. The blacksmith was gripping a hammer. The store owner had a shotgun, and even old Mrs. Harlow had a cast iron skillet in her hand like she meant business. As the gang slowed their horses in front of the saloon, a voice rang out from somewhere high. Now bags of flour burst open from the rooftops, blinding half the riders in a cloud of white dust. The rest tried to push forward, but were met with barrels, sticks, and more than once, the crack of a rifle. One bullet found its mark, catching a rider in the shoulder and sending him tumbling. The rest of the gang froze, realizing that this wasn't just Ethan standing in their way, but hey, it was the whole damn town. From every doorway and alley, people were closing in, eyes hard, hands steady. And then everyone waited to see what Ethan would do next. Ethan stepped forward, banged the head of his hammer against the ground once, and said, "Come back here again, and there won't be a way out." It wasn't shouted. It didn't have to be. The stillness in the street after that sentence said it all. The leader spat in the dust, looked around at a town that wasn't afraid anymore, and gave the signal to turn back. They rode out slower than they came in, not daring to look over their shoulders. Word later spread that they'd picked another town to bleed, one that hadn't yet found its backbone. And just like that, Dry Creek was quiet again. Not the fearful kind of quiet, the kind that comes when folks know they've stood their ground. And the gang was gone, their hoofbeats fading into the distance. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, folks began to step out from behind barrels and doorways, dusting off their clothes, glancing at one another as if to say, we really did it. Clara walked across the street toward Ethan, her dress torn but her head held high. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him, eyes soft but steady. He gave a small nod, the kind that says more than words ever could. In the days that followed, Dry Creek settled into a new rhythm. Merchants kept their doors open without looking over their shoulders. Kids played in the street again, and Ethan, well, he still spent most of his days working the ranch, but every morning he found himself stopping by Clara's bakery before heading out, sometimes for bread, sometimes for pie, and always for the company. It wasn't some whirlwind romance. It was something steadier, the kind that comes from two people who've both known loss, who understand the quiet comfort of simply not being alone anymore. Folks in town noticed, and they approved. After all, in a place like Dry Creek, you don't just survive on your own. You survive because you've got someone watching your back. Maybe that's the real lesson here. A town doesn't change because one man stands up. It changes when everyone decides they're done living in fear. And sometimes the strength to stand up comes from the person you least expect, or the one you've cared about all along. So here's my question to you. If you'd been there that day, would you have stepped out into the street, Or would you have waited for someone else to go first? If you enjoyed riding through this story with me, give it a like. It helps more than you know. And if you want to hear more tales from the Old West, the kind that make you feel like you're standing right there in the dust and the sun, hit that subscribe button. There's more to come, and trust me, you don't want to miss it.